Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the Arkansas Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The autumn of 1921 brought an unusually harsh cold to the Arkansas Ozarks, where the limestone bluffs cast long shadows over hollows that seemed to swallow sound itself. It was in Newton County, along the remote ridges near the Buffalo National River, that a discovery would be made that local authorities would spend decades trying to understand, classify, and ultimately forget. The case file, archived in Little Rock in 1963, contains testimonies, photographs, and reports that read more like the fevered imaginings of a disturbed mind than official documentation. Yet every signature, every stamp, every witness statement bears the weight of truth that continues to disturb those few researchers granted access to the materials. Ezra Holloway had been tracking deer through the dense hardwood forests for 3 days when he stumbled upon what would later be described in police reports as human remains in an unusual state of preservation. The location was a natural limestone cave, approximately 4 miles southeast of the small settlement of Jasper, accessible only by following a narrow game trail that wound between towering oak trees, whose branches formed a canopy so thick that midday resembled twilight. Holloway, a man in his early 50s who had spent most of his adult life navigating these mountains, claimed he had never seen this particular cave before, despite having hunted the same territory for over 20 years. This assertion would prove to be only the first of many contradictions that would define the case. According to Holloway's initial statement to Sheriff Cordelia Vance, given on November 18, 1921, an overwhelming smell reached him first. "It wasn't the smell of anything I'd ever encountered," he told investigators during his first interview. "Something that made my hunting dogs whimper and refuse to go further." The description he provided would be echoed by every law enforcement officer who subsequently visited the site. Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Crane, in his official report, described the odor as penetrating and persistent, unlike any natural occurrence encountered in previous investigations. What Holloway discovered inside that cave would haunt him for the remainder of his days, though he would speak of it only twice more before his death in 1934, under circumstances that remain unexplained. The figure discovered in the cave defied simple explanation. Initial examination suggested human remains, but the condition of the body raised questions that traditional methods could not address. Dr. Matthias Gorman, the county's only medical examiner, would later write in his private notes that the discovery challenged every assumption he had made about death and preservation. His official reports, written for public consumption, described the remains in clinical terms that concealed the true strangeness of what had been found. Before that November morning, Ezra Holloway lived a life of predictable solitude in a cabin he had built himself near the headwaters of War Eagle Creek. The structure stood in a clearing that he had carved from the dense forest over a period of several years, using hand tools and techniques learned during his military service in the Spanish-American War. The cabin itself was a testament to both his skill and his desire for complete self-sufficiency. Built entirely of local timber and limestone, it featured a root cellar, a smokehouse, and a workshop where he maintained his hunting equipment and repaired items for neighbors who occasionally sought his assistance. Holloway was known throughout Newton County as a reliable hunter and trapper, a man who could track wounded game through terrain that would challenge even experienced mountain men. His reputation extended beyond simple hunting skills. Local residents sought his advice on matters ranging from weather prediction to livestock management, recognizing his intimate understanding of natural cycles and animal behavior. His nearest neighbors, the Brennan family, lived nearly 3 miles away across rugged terrain. Yet they maintained regular contact with him through a system of signal fires and marked trees that allowed communication across the forested valleys. The isolation suited Holloway's temperament perfectly. He had returned from military service with what would now be recognized as symptoms of wartime stress, though such understanding did not exist in rural Arkansas in 1899. His preference for solitude was interpreted by neighbors as a reasonable response to the harshness of military life, and his occasional episodes of intense vigilance were attributed to habits formed during wartime service. What his neighbors did not know was that Holloway's military records contained references to incidents during his service that had been classified and sealed, incidents that had left him with a deep distrust of certain situations and a preference for the predictable patterns of wilderness life. His daily routine had established a rhythm that connected him intimately with the natural cycles of the mountains. Holloway could predict weather changes by the behavior of birds, identify the presence of predators by subtle changes in the forest's ambient sounds, and navigate in complete darkness, using landmarks that would be invisible to anyone else. This deep familiarity with his environment made what he discovered that November all the more unsettling. He had learned to read the forest like a book, understanding its moods and messages with remarkable accuracy. Yet the cave and its contents had existed within his territory without his knowledge. The morning of November 15, 1921, began like countless others for Holloway. He had risen before dawn, consumed his usual breakfast of coffee and cold cornbread, and set out to check trap lines he had established along the ridge above his cabin. The weather had been unusually warm for November, with temperatures reaching into the upper 60s during the day, unusual enough that he had noted it in his journal as a potential sign of a harsh winter to come. Several of his traps had been disturbed in ways that suggested the presence of a large predator, possibly a black bear preparing for winter hibernation, though the pattern of disturbance was unlike anything he had observed in his decades of hunting experience. The signs he followed that morning told a story that did not align with his understanding of animal behavior in the region. The tracks he discovered were partially human in appearance, but showed characteristics that suggested someone moving with deliberate care through difficult terrain. The stride length was inconsistent, sometimes matching that of a tall person, other times showing the shorter, more careful steps of someone navigating treacherous ground. Most disturbing was the evidence that whatever had made these tracks had been near his cabin, observing from concealed positions in the surrounding forest. Following the trail that led deeper into the forest than his usual routes, Holloway found himself in terrain he recognized but had rarely explored. The land here was more rugged, cut by deep hollows and marked by limestone outcroppings that created natural shelters and caves. It was while following what appeared to be drag marks in the soft earth near one of these formations that he first noticed the smell that would be burned into his memory for the remainder of his life. His hunting dogs, two experienced blue-tick hounds that normally showed no fear of any forest predator, stopped abruptly and began to whimper. When Holloway called them forward, they refused to advance, instead retreating several yards and lying down with their heads between their paws. In his statement to Sheriff Vance, Holloway described the odor as like something that had been wrong for a very long time. The dog's reaction was so extreme that one of them, a veteran hunting companion that had never shown cowardice in the face of bears or wildcats, actually became sick and refused to enter the forest again for several weeks. The cave entrance was partially concealed by fallen branches and limestone debris, as if someone had attempted to close off the opening from the inside. The arrangement of materials was deliberate, showing signs of careful planning and execution. When Holloway cleared the debris and stepped into the cave, carrying a kerosene lantern, what he saw would change not only his understanding of the wilderness he thought he knew, but his fundamental assumptions about what kinds of secrets could exist in familiar places. The interior of the cave had been extensively modified, with carved passages and chambers that showed evidence of long-term habitation and careful organization. The figure he discovered was seated against the back wall of the main chamber, surrounded by objects and materials that defied easy explanation. The remains appeared human in basic structure, but were preserved in a way that seemed impossible, given the environment. The individual had been dead for some time, yet the condition of the body suggested that natural decay had been somehow prevented. More disturbing was the evidence that the person had remained in this state for an extended period, as if death itself had been delayed or interrupted. When word reached Sheriff Cordelia Vance about Holloway's discovery, the initial response was measured and methodical. Vance, one of the few female law enforcement officers in Arkansas at the time, had built her reputation on careful investigation and thorough documentation of evidence. Her appointment to the position had been controversial, but her success in solving several challenging cases had earned her the respect of both her colleagues and the community. She had dealt with various unusual incidents in the sparsely populated mountain counties, including bear attacks, hunting accidents, and occasional discoveries of human remains, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for what Holloway had found. The official report filed by Deputy Marshal Thaddeus Crane, who accompanied Vance to the cave site on November 19th, describes the discovered remains in careful terms that barely hint at the true nature of the discovery. Crane, a veteran of both military service and law enforcement, was known for his unflappable demeanor and methodical approach to evidence collection. His report describes a human form, remarkably preserved, covered partially in animal hides that appeared to have been sewn together with unusual skill. The figure measured approximately 6 feet in length and was found in a seated position against the back wall of the cave, surrounded by what Crane described as personal effects and objects of unknown origin. The personal effects found with the remains included items that would later be identified as belonging to residents of Newton County who had gone missing over the previous several years. A brass button from a coat worn by Marcus Ashby, who had vanished during a hunting trip 2 years earlier. A silver hairpin that belonged to Ruth Caldwell, who had disappeared while gathering herbs in the spring of 1920. A leather wallet containing identification papers for James Morrison, who had been reported missing in 1919 while traveling between settlements. The presence of these items suggested that the cave's occupant had somehow come into possession of belongings from missing persons, but the condition and arrangement of the objects indicated something more complex than simple acquisition. Dr. Matthias Gorman, summoned from Harrison to conduct the examination, arrived at the cave site on November 21st. His initial assessment, conducted by lamplight in the confined space of the cave, revealed anomalies that would trouble him for the remainder of his career. The remains showed signs of preservation that were far more sophisticated than anything achievable with local methods. The body appeared to have been treated with unknown substances that had somehow maintained its integrity in conditions that should have caused rapid deterioration. What disturbed Dr. Gorman most was the discovery that the body showed signs of having been carefully tended during an extended period. The positioning, the condition of the surrounding materials, and the state of preservation all suggested that someone had been maintaining the remains, caring for them in ways that defied explanation. The level of preservation achieved represented knowledge that exceeded anything available in rural Arkansas in 1921. The examination of the cave itself revealed a level of organization and planning that suggested long-term habitation and systematic activity. The main chamber had been expanded and shaped using hand tools with carved niches and shelves that held collections of objects organized according to principles that Dr. Gorman could not decipher. The walls were covered with markings that appeared to be a form of written communication, though they bore no resemblance to any known writing system. These markings were accompanied by detailed drawings that depicted human figures in various poses and states of preservation. The explanation offered to the local community was straightforward and designed to minimize speculation and prevent panic. According to official statements released by Sheriff Vance, a hermit living in the wilderness had passed away from natural causes during the previous winter. The animal hides found with the body were explained as crude winter clothing, and the isolated location of the cave was presented as evidence of the individual's desire to live away from civilization. The personal effects found with the remains were attributed to items the hermit had found or traded for during his years of isolation. This narrative satisfied most residents of Newton County, who were accustomed to stories of people choosing to live alone in the mountains and who had no desire to delve deeper into disturbing details. However, several elements documented in the official reports were not shared with the general public. The condition of the animal hides suggested they had been processed and sewn with tools and techniques that differed significantly from standard frontier practices. The stitching patterns showed influences from multiple cultural traditions, including methods used by indigenous peoples of the region, European leatherworking techniques, and approaches that appeared to be entirely original. More troubling was the discovery of what Dr. Gorman described as unusual materials embedded within the preserved remains, materials that did not appear to be of local origin. The unusual materials, when examined under the limited magnification available to Dr. Gorman, appeared organic in nature but showed characteristics that did not match any known classifications. They seemed to serve some kind of supportive function, maintaining the integrity of the remains in ways that natural preservation could not account for. Some of these materials appeared to be connected to various parts of the body, creating a network that served unknown purposes. Dr. Gorman's attempts to understand these materials were unsuccessful, as they seemed to deteriorate when disturbed. The weeks following the official explanation passed quietly in Newton County, but careful observation revealed subtle changes in the behavior of both people and animals in the area. The cave was sealed by order of Sheriff Vance, ostensibly to prevent scavengers from disturbing the site, though local residents noticed that the seal was constructed with unusual thoroughness, involving both large stones and mortar that would have required significant effort to install. The work was carried out by deputies from outside the county, men who completed their task quickly and departed without interacting with local residents. Holloway returned to his normal routine, though neighbors observed that he seemed to avoid certain areas of the forest and had begun checking his trap lines in pairs rather than alone. The Brennan family, whose property bordered some of Holloway's usual hunting grounds, reported that their neighbor had become increasingly reluctant to discuss his discovery. When Silas Brennan encountered Holloway at the Jasper General Store in December 1921, he noted that the hunter appeared to have lost considerable weight and spoke in whispers, even when discussing routine matters like weather and livestock prices. More significantly, several residents of the area began reporting subtle changes in the forest itself that could not be easily explained or dismissed. Sounds that had been constant features of the mountain environment seemed muted or absent entirely. The normal chorus of birds that provided a backdrop to daily life in the mountains became sporadic and uncertain. Livestock showed unusual nervousness when grazing in certain areas, clustering together in tight groups and refusing to wander into sections of pasture they had previously used freely. Experienced hunters reported difficulty finding game along trails they had used successfully for years, as if animals had abandoned familiar territory without explanation. These changes were gradual enough that they could be attributed to seasonal variations or natural fluctuations in animal populations, but their cumulative effect was a growing sense that something fundamental had shifted in the familiar landscape. Adults found themselves reluctant to venture into the woods alone, particularly during twilight hours, when shadows created countless hiding places for unseen observers. The forest, once a source of livelihood and comfort, began to feel like a place where unknown presences might be watching from concealed positions. Dr. Gorman's continued examination of the evidence collected from the cave proceeded slowly and in secret during the winter months of 1921 and 1922. His notes, discovered decades later when his estate was settled, reveal growing concern about elements of the discovery that did not align with any known categories. The unusual materials found within the remains appeared to be not just organic in nature, but somehow involved in maintaining the preserved state of the body. Areas that should have continued to deteriorate instead showed signs of stabilization. Parts of the remains that should have been destroyed by natural processes maintained their form in ways that Dr. Gorman measured using primitive equipment borrowed from the local telegraph office. Most disturbing was his discovery that certain areas continued to respond to outside influences, suggesting that some form of activity might persist even in the preserved state. The implications of these findings were too troubling for official acknowledgement, and Dr. Gorman found himself in the position of documenting discoveries that he could not share with either his colleagues or the broader medical community. His private correspondence with colleagues at medical schools in Little Rock and Memphis hints at the nature of his findings without providing specific details, reflecting his struggle to understand phenomena that challenged every aspect of his training. In the winter months of 1922, as heavy snows isolated many mountain communities, the silence surrounding the cave discovery deepened. Official inquiries had been concluded, reports had been filed, and the case had been marked as resolved in law enforcement records. Yet, for those who had direct knowledge of what was found in that limestone cave, the resolution felt more like a deliberate forgetting than a genuine understanding. The questions raised by the discovery had not been answered, but simply set aside, filed away in archives where they could be safely ignored. Sheriff Vance, despite her reputation for thoroughness, found herself under pressure from state authorities to conclude the investigation and move on to other matters. The pressure was subtle but persistent, taking the form of suggested transfers to other positions, budget constraints that limited her access to resources, and administrative requirements that consumed time and energy that could have been devoted to continued investigation. She complied with these pressures, but her private notes revealed deep frustration with the official response to the discovery. From Holloway's perspective, the horror of that November discovery lay not in what he had seen, but in what he had understood. The seated figure in the cave, draped in its sewn collection of animal hides, had not been positioned randomly. The arrangement suggested deliberate placement, as if the individual had been carefully positioned and maintained in that state for reasons that remained unclear. More disturbing was the realization that the cave showed signs of long-term habitation, with carved markings on the walls that indicated someone had been present and active for an extended period. The objects surrounding the remains told a story of careful collection and organization that suggested planning and purpose rather than random accumulation. Each item had been cleaned, sorted, and placed according to criteria that remained unclear but obviously meaningful to whoever had arranged them. Personal effects from missing persons were mixed with natural specimens, tools, and materials that appeared to have been gathered from across a wide geographic area. The arrangement suggested that the cave had served as some kind of storage facility, though the purpose of the collection remained mysterious. Most unsettling was Holloway's discovery of items that appeared to be personal effects from people who were still alive and living in the community. A button from a dress worn by Martha Brennan, Silas's wife, who continued to live on the neighboring property. A piece of harness from equipment owned by Sam Hutchins, who operated the general store in Jasper. A page from a journal written by Dr. Gorman himself, containing entries he insisted he had never written, but which captured his thoughts and observations with uncanny accuracy. The implications of these discoveries suggested that whoever had occupied the cave had been collecting information and personal items from community members through methods that remained unclear. The level of detail in the collected materials indicated intimate knowledge of daily routines, personal relationships, and private activities that could only have been gathered through careful and prolonged observation. This realization transformed Holloway's understanding of his years of solitary life in the mountains, forcing him to confront the possibility that his isolation had been an illusion and that he had been watched throughout his residence in the area. The spring of 1936 brought renewed attention to the sealed cave when a surveying team working for the newly established Buffalo National River Project reported unusual findings in the area. The federal government's decision to designate the Buffalo River as a national river represented a significant change in the management and oversight of the region, bringing federal personnel and resources to areas that had previously been under purely local control. The surveying work was intended to assess the recreational potential of the area and to identify sites of historical or archaeological significance that might warrant special protection or development. While conducting geological assessments for potential recreational development, surveyors discovered evidence of additional cave systems connected to the original site that Sheriff Vance had sealed 15 years earlier. These caves, previously unknown to local residents, contained what appeared to be deliberately constructed chambers and passages that extended far deeper into the mountain than natural formation would explain. The discovery was made when survey equipment detected hollow spaces beneath areas that appeared to be solid rock, leading to more detailed exploration that revealed an extensive underground network. Dr. Harrison Voss, an archaeologist from the University of Arkansas who was brought in to assess the historical significance of the cave system, found himself confronting evidence that challenged his understanding of both the region's history and the nature of the original discovery. His preliminary report, submitted to state authorities in June 1936, described architectural features that suggested sophisticated knowledge of engineering principles, yet constructed using only primitive tools and materials available to local populations during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The cave system revealed by Dr. Voss's investigation was far more extensive and complex than the single chamber that Holloway had discovered in 1921. Passages connected multiple chambers arranged in a pattern that suggested careful planning and construction over an extended period. Some chambers showed evidence of specific functions, with carved shelves and work surfaces that indicated use as workshops or storage areas. Others contained collections of materials organized according to systems that remained unclear but obviously meaningful to their creators. More troubling was Dr. Voss's discovery of additional personal effects scattered throughout the connected cave system. Items of clothing, jewelry, and personal belongings that appeared to span several decades were found in chambers that showed signs of organized storage and cataloging. Each item was accompanied by detailed notes written in various handwritings, documenting the habits, preferences, and daily patterns of the object's original owners. The notes were written with careful precision, recording observations about routines, social interactions, and personal characteristics with a level of detail that suggested extensive observation and study. The pattern that emerged from Dr. Voss's investigation suggested that the cave system had served as a base of operations for careful observation and collection activities targeting residents of Newton County over an extended period. The individual whose remains Holloway had discovered appeared to have been the final occupant of a site that had been used for similar purposes by multiple previous inhabitants. Evidence suggested that the operation had been ongoing for at least 50 years, with different individuals taking over responsibility for the observation and collection activities as previous occupants passed away or moved on. The scope of the operation, revealed by Dr. Voss's work, exceeded anything that local law enforcement had previously encountered. Maps drawn on cave walls showed the locations of every residence in Newton County, along with detailed information about the daily routines of their occupants. Personal profiles had been compiled for dozens of community members, documenting their preferences, relationships, and daily habits with careful precision. Most disturbing was the discovery of detailed records that seemed to track the movements and activities of specific individuals over extended periods. When authorities attempted to locate Ezra Holloway to discuss these new findings, they discovered that he had abandoned his cabin sometime during the winter of 1935-36. The discovery of his absence was made when federal surveyors attempted to contact him about access rights to his property. Neighbors reported that he had not been seen since early November, though his property showed no signs of violence or sudden departure. His belongings remained in place, his trap lines were still set, and his livestock were properly cared for, suggesting that he had planned to return but never did. The investigation into Holloway's disappearance uncovered a disturbing pattern in the documentation he had left behind. His personal journals from the years following the cave discovery revealed growing concern about being watched and studied. He described finding evidence that someone had been in his cabin during his absences, moving objects slightly and examining his possessions. Items would be returned to almost their original positions, but with subtle differences that suggested careful examination and cataloging. More alarming were his accounts of discovering freshly written notes in his own handwriting, describing activities and thoughts he insisted he had never recorded. The notes found in Holloway's cabin documented aspects of his daily routine with obsessive detail, recording information about his habits, preferences, and personal patterns that could only have been gathered through careful observation. What made these discoveries particularly unsettling was that the handwriting was unmistakably his own, yet he insisted he had no memory of writing any of the material. The notes described his thoughts and feelings during specific events with an accuracy that would have been impossible for an outside observer to achieve. Yet they were written from an external perspective that suggested someone else was documenting his experiences. Dr. Voss's archaeological work continued through the summer of 1936, revealing the full extent of the cave system and its organized arrangement of chambers and passages. What he found in the deepest accessible chamber would ultimately lead to the classification of all materials related to the site and the permanent sealing of the entire cave system. His final report, restricted to a small number of government officials, described discoveries that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of rural communities and the possibility of maintaining observation operations in isolated areas. The deepest chamber contained what appeared to be a central archive of information about residents of Newton County and surrounding areas. Detailed maps showing the locations of every residence were accompanied by comprehensive personal profiles of their occupants. The profiles included information about daily routines, personal relationships, individual characteristics, and habits that could only have been gathered through extensive and careful observation conducted over many years. The level of detail was extraordinary, documenting not only observable behaviors, but also private information that suggested access through means that remained unclear. Among the documents found in the deepest chamber was a collection of journals written by multiple individuals over a span of several decades. These journals described a coordinated effort to study mountain communities throughout the Arkansas Ozarks. The writers documented techniques for observing individuals without detection, methods for collecting personal effects and information, and strategies for creating detailed personal profiles. The journals revealed an organized effort with goals that extended far beyond simple observation or research. The scope of the operation described in the journals suggested a group working with resources and knowledge that exceeded anything law enforcement had previously encountered. The level of detail in the personal profiles, the sophistication of the observation techniques, and the apparent duration of the activities indicated planning and coordination that required significant support and careful management. Most disturbing was the clear evidence that the operation had been successful in maintaining complete secrecy for decades while conducting intensive observation of multiple communities. Dr. Voss's attempts to trace the origins of the documents and understand the structure behind the operation led him to archives in Little Rock, where he discovered references to similar discoveries in other isolated communities throughout Arkansas and neighboring states. Reports dating back to the 1880s described findings of prepared caves, collections of personal effects, and personal documentation that followed patterns identical to what had been found in Newton County. The consistency of these discoveries suggested a coordinated effort involving multiple sites and operatives, working according to shared methods and objectives. The geographical distribution of similar discoveries indicated that the group had been operating across a wide area for an extended period, suggesting resources and coordination capabilities that exceeded those of any known organization. The consistent methods and materials found at different sites indicated central planning and training, while the duration of the operations suggested continuity across multiple generations. The implications of these findings raised questions about the true nature of community life in isolated rural areas and the extent to which apparently independent settlements might have been subject to external observation and influence. The final report, submitted by Dr. Voss in September 1936, recommended immediate and permanent closure of the cave system, classification of all related materials, and termination of any further investigation. His recommendations were based not only on the disturbing nature of the discoveries, but also on his growing concern that continued investigation might compromise ongoing operations or attract unwanted attention from those responsible for the observation activities. His recommendations were accepted without review, and within weeks, the cave system was filled with concrete, and the site was removed from all official maps and surveys. The decision to terminate the investigation and classify all related materials reflected concerns that extended beyond the immediate findings at the Newton County site. Federal authorities had become aware of similar discoveries at multiple locations across the southeastern United States, suggesting that the Arkansas findings were part of a much larger pattern of activities. The organized nature of the observation operations and the sophisticated methods employed raised questions about the identity and objectives of those responsible, leading to decisions to limit knowledge of the discoveries to a small number of individuals with appropriate clearances. In the years following the sealing of the caves, several residents of Newton County reported experiences that suggested the activities documented in the cave system had not been entirely eliminated. Livestock continued to show unusual nervousness in certain areas, clustering together and refusing to graze in locations they had previously used freely. Hunters occasionally discovered evidence of recent observation posts in locations that should have been undisturbed, including cleared sight lines to residential areas and caches of supplies that appeared to be maintained by unknown individuals. These reports were typically dismissed as imagination or misidentification, but their consistency and detail suggested that something of the original operation might have continued in modified form. The reports came from reliable individuals with extensive experience in wilderness areas, people who were unlikely to misinterpret natural phenomena or fabricate unusual experiences. The pattern of reports suggested that observation activities might have resumed or continued using different methods and locations, adapting to the increased attention that had resulted from the official investigations. The fate of Ezra Holloway remained unknown until 1962, when construction workers building a new section of highway through the mountains discovered human remains in a remote area, approximately 15 miles from his original cabin. The remains were identified through dental records maintained by Dr. Gorman, though the circumstances of their discovery raised questions that were never officially addressed. Holloway's body was found in a seated position against a limestone outcropping, covered with carefully sewn animal hides and surrounded by personal effects that included items belonging to other missing residents of the region. The condition of Holloway's remains was remarkably similar to that of the figure he had discovered in the cave in 1921. The body showed signs of the same type of preservation that Dr. Gorman had documented in his original examination. Most disturbing was the evidence that Holloway had been maintained in this preserved state for an extended period, suggesting that he had somehow become part of the same mysterious process that had affected the original cave occupant. The discovery raised troubling questions about his disappearance and the possibility that he had been involved with those responsible for the observation operations. The final documentation of the case came in 1967, when the Arkansas State Archives received a collection of materials from the estate of Dr. Matthias Gorman, who had died the previous year. Among these materials was a sealed envelope containing photographs and notes from his examination of the original cave discovery in 1921. These documents revealed details that had been excluded from his official reports, including evidence that the individual found in the cave had remained in a preserved state for an extended period through unknown means. Dr. Gorman's private notes described samples that showed signs of careful treatment, suggesting that natural processes had been somehow controlled or prevented. More disturbing was his discovery of areas that remained stable long after deterioration should have occurred, indicating that some form of preservation had been maintained through methods that exceeded contemporary understanding. The notes included detailed diagrams showing the various ways in which the body had been maintained, revealing techniques that appeared to blend multiple approaches to preservation. The implications of these findings were too troubling for official acknowledgement, and Dr. Gorman had chosen to document them privately while submitting simplified versions to authorities. His decision to seal these materials and arrange for their release only after his death reflected his belief that the truth of what had been discovered in the Newton County caves should be preserved, even if it could not be publicly acknowledged. His notes revealed the existence of preservation techniques that challenged basic assumptions about death and the limits of contemporary knowledge. The private materials released from Dr. Gorman's estate included correspondence with colleagues at medical institutions across the United States, revealing that similar discoveries had been made in other locations but had been similarly suppressed or classified. The correspondence described a network of researchers who had encountered evidence of organized preservation activities but had been unable or unwilling to share their findings publicly. The pattern of discoveries suggested a coordinated program involving human subjects that had been conducted in secret for decades. Today, the location where Holloway made his discovery remains unmarked and largely forgotten, though the concrete seal placed over the cave system in 1936 has weathered and partially collapsed. Access to the site is restricted by its remote location and difficult terrain, but park rangers occasionally report finding evidence of unauthorized visitors to the area. These incidents include freshly disturbed soil, signs of recent excavation, and equipment caches that suggest ongoing interest in the site from unknown parties. The reports are typically attributed to treasure hunters or amateur archaeologists, but the sophisticated equipment and careful approach suggested by the evidence indicates visitors with serious research objectives. The official records of the case remain classified in climate-controlled facilities where they are accessible only to researchers with specific security clearances. The few scholars who have been granted access to these materials have typically concluded their research quickly and declined to pursue further investigation, though their published work carefully avoids any direct reference to their findings. The pattern of abbreviated research projects and reluctance to publish results suggests that the classified materials contain information that continues to be considered sensitive or dangerous to public knowledge. Local residents of Newton County, particularly those whose families have lived in the area for multiple generations, occasionally share stories that echo themes from the original discovery. These stories describe family members who disappeared into the mountains and returned changed, neighbors whose behavior became subtly different over time, and the persistent sense that certain areas of the forest continue to hold secrets. The stories are typically shared only within trusted family circles and are rarely discussed with outsiders, reflecting a collective understanding that some knowledge is too dangerous to spread widely. The oral traditions maintained by local families include references to activities that predate the documented discoveries by many decades. Stories describe mysterious visitors who would appear in remote areas for brief periods before disappearing, leaving behind signs of temporary camps and observation posts. Other stories reference community members who would vanish for extended periods and return with knowledge or abilities they had not previously possessed, suggesting involvement in activities conducted by unknown groups. The persistence of these oral traditions suggests that the observation activities documented in the official records represent only the most recent phase of operations that may have been ongoing for much longer than official sources acknowledge. The stories describe patterns of activity that extend back to the earliest settlement of the region, suggesting that outside groups may have been present and active in the area since the initial arrival of European-American settlers in the early 19th century. The sound of wind through the limestone caves of the Arkansas Ozarks carries echoes that seem to persist longer than physics would suggest. On quiet nights, when the air is still and the mountains hold their breath, residents of Newton County sometimes hear what sounds like whispered conversations coming from places where no one should be. These sounds are typically dismissed as natural phenomena, the ordinary voice of stone and wind, but they remind those who listen carefully that some discoveries are too significant to remain buried, and some silences are too profound to trust completely. The acoustic properties of the limestone cave systems create conditions where sounds can travel long distances underground and emerge at unexpected locations, leading to reports of voices and conversations that seem to come from solid rock or empty forest. Local residents have learned to distinguish between natural acoustic phenomena and sounds that suggest human activity, though they rarely investigate sources that cannot be easily identified. The caution reflects generations of accumulated wisdom about the dangers of curiosity in areas where unknown groups may maintain ongoing operations. Modern equipment installed in the region for geological research has occasionally detected underground activity that suggests continued human presence in sealed or hidden cave systems. The readings indicate movement and activities occurring at depths that should be inaccessible, raising questions about the completeness of the closure operations conducted in 1936. Federal authorities continued to monitor these readings, but their responses to detected activity remain classified, suggesting ongoing concern about the status of the original operations. The case file remains open in the archives, marked neither solved nor unsolved, but simply documented. Like the mountains themselves, it endures, patient and unchanging, waiting for someone curious enough and brave enough to ask the questions that were never officially answered. The documentation serves as a record of discoveries that challenged understanding of human capabilities and organizational activities in isolated areas, preserving evidence for future researchers who may have access to better methods and resources for investigating the phenomena described in the reports. In the Arkansas Ozarks, where the landscape keeps its secrets as carefully as it keeps its dead, some stories continue even when their telling has ended, echoing through generations like voices carried on mountain winds that never quite fade away. The region continues to attract researchers and investigators drawn by rumors and fragmentary evidence, but the difficulties of accessing the original sites and the classified status of the official records ensure that many questions remain unanswered. The mystery persists, protected by distance, secrecy, and the natural tendency of isolated communities to maintain silence about events that challenge their understanding of the world around them.